Self-presentation and impression management. As we know, impressions really are important. Because sport is conducted in more or less a social environment, our work usually involves some audience, right? And so managing the impressions of folks there and yourself, this is going to be important to sport organizational effectiveness. Social facilitation research is important for talking about managing impressions, and it's really based on the simple notion that if you have an audience, then that's going to facilitate and eventually impact performance. All right, there's this pretty famous model, the social facilitation model, and it is based upon drive theory, which simply notes that the mere presence of an audience has the effect of increasing arousal level. All right, again, we're talking about arousal in terms of engagement and those types of things. Increasing the engagement, as the theory goes, will facilitate the performance of extremely skilled athletes. But there's a slight decrease or diminishing performance for those that are less skilled athletes. All right, so it really talks about the power of that particular audience. Now, one limitation of this particular theory and way of looking at things is that how do we demonstrate that the quote-unquote mere presence of an audience actually impacts engagement, excitement, those types of things, right? In the real world of sports, the audience is never merely present or non-interactive, right? It's going to be difficult to kind of develop or be able to measure that in a perfect world. So therefore, the sport fans insisting upon interacting with the athletes, it's hard to say that's present or not present, right? So, but while the theory does have some limitations, it really does help sort of set the stage for thinking about things like public relations, community relations, those types of things. Self-presentation is, for our purposes, it's called impression management, and it really just speaks to the processes associated with how people are going to monitor and potentially sometimes control how they are going to be perceived by others. So it's dealing with that impression, whether it's on social media, whether it's at a community appearance, or whether it's on TV on the sidelines, whatever it is, right? And this is really born out of a social scientist named Goffman, who in the early 1960s developed what he called dramaturgical analysis. And it was really interesting because it's talking about how we manage our impression. And he sort of used the analogy of being in the stage, the world of theater, right? So you're on stage, you have these different props, you engage in a performance, those types of things. So while you can probably think of elite athletes, being on stage, on TV, that kind of thing, I want you to think about dramaturgical analysis from a personal point of view, right? Think about when you interview for a job, right? You're playing a part. You're kind of on stage, right? And so you're going to wear a costume, you're going to dress appropriately, and even sometimes you're going to have a script, you're going to have different things that you say. And that's really all Goffman's trying to get at, is that depending upon the situation, you might engage in impression management, okay? Now there are two different types. There's impression motivation and impression construction. The impression motivation is really, if we're kind of thinking about in terms of the elite athlete, for example, the athlete's trying to regulate other people's impression of them, right? So what kind of impression am I as an athlete having upon my community, on the team, those types of things. Impression construction really is focused more on the types of images and that the athlete's going to try to convey to other people. So slight differentiation between the two, but both are really part of this larger process of impression management that Goffman talked about when he developed his theory of dramaturgical analysis. Some effects of self-presentation: obviously you're going to have a positive effect and then a negative effect. The positive effect is that, kind of similarly what we were talking about with the social facilitation model, is that an audience is going to enhance, or at the very least impact, performance, right? Well, that negative effect, self-attention, this is kind of one aspect of it, and we'll talk about self-handicapping as well. But this is becoming almost too concerned with things around you, and your confidence is probably going to decrease, right? When you start examining too much of the world around you, then it can start to kind of get in your own head. Now, we know that attention in sports psychology is important. In fact, here's a required reading. So as per usual, just make sure you're in presentation mode, click on that, and it'll be able to take you to that required reading. But it really highlights the importance of attention in sports and in a sports psychology point of view. What self-attention is talking about is almost taking that too far, right? It's becoming too concerned, overly concerned with the things around you, and that can have a negative performance impact. Self-handicapping is a form of self-presentation where the athlete primarily is attempting to regulate the impression that other people are going to have of them, and oftentimes this is done ahead of time. Let's talk a little bit more about self-handicapping. So it proposes, quote unquote, individuals make pre-planned, proactive use of effort reduction and performance excuses in order to protect their self-esteem from potential negative feedback within a socially evaluative setting. Okay, there's a lot there. There's a lot of words, a lot of jargon. What's it talking about? It's that if we're kind of sticking with the athletic example, the athlete is thinking about and kind of being, it's almost like the old reverse psychology that so many students tend to use and employ when it comes to an exam, right? So you're kind of putting out potential excuses ahead of time so that if you do indeed fail, you can kind of buffer the negative response or reaction to that failure because you've already put this potential rationale out there. So example, an athlete calls in sick or discloses an injury to the media the day before the competition. Let's think about that. Why would they disclose the injury? So much of professional athletics is kind of hiding and engaging in subterfuge in terms of injuries so that people don't necessarily know a weakness. But if you are to disclose that potential injury to the media ahead of the competition, or ahead of the game or the competition, then what you've done is you've identified that if you perform poorly, then it's probably due to this particular injury, for example, or being out of practice, and therefore you're not able to be fully prepared, right? If you happen to do really well, then people sort of forget that you were injured, or they talk about kind of that athlete's performance in terms of kind of a heroic performance, right? They're able to overcome the injury, those types of things. And as I was saying earlier, students often do this, kind of engage in self-handicapping with exams. So if you say you're going to perform poorly on a particular quiz or study because you didn't study, okay, then you're either going to be right? You performed poorly and therefore you had kind of an honest assessment of it, or you can be surprised and yes, I was wrong in my assessment, but I did really well. So either way, it's kind of a win-win for me. So there's this kind of famous research talking about what they called flyers and bombers, and it's talking about students in regards to exams and this whole idea of self-handicapping. Oftentimes, if you think about a test situation, whenever I teach in the classrooms and stuff, and I hear students talking about exams, nobody is ever very proud and say, "Oh, I studied really hard for this test, and I feel like I'm going to do really well." All the chatter that I would hear is about, "Oh my gosh, I tried to pull an all-nighter, or I didn't even study for this test." And you do that because you're trying to manage expectations of potential failure, right? So you're either going to be right. Yes, I was correct in my assessment. I did fail, but I've already put out the justification as to why. Right? I wasn't able to study because I tried to pull an all-nighter, which, by the way, we know really doesn't work terribly well in terms of the mind absorbing information, because I had to work or whatever it was. You put those rationales or excuses out there so that everyone is aware of the potential failure and the justification for it.